I'm not sure I always do it well. I remember one particular guy came up to me and said, "You were so good, I forgot you were a woman." And I didn't really know how to respond to that at all. And it's not always worth taking on criticism, is it? Particularly not at the time. Sometimes it's just something to go away and pray about and think about. However, on other occasions, it is worth saying, well, why do you say that? I think one of the interesting things was a guy who said to me, "I missed the first 5 minutes because you're a woman, but the rest of what you said was good." So I said, well, why not get rid of your prejudice and listen from the beginning, and then you'd get like 3 times as much good stuff. It is that hidden sexism, isn't it? That as soon as a woman stands up in a woman's body, people make assumptions about what you're going to say. Women do it as well. Women assume that you're going to be nice and cuddly and talk about flowers and bunny rabbits and things sometimes. So when you don't, that's difficult. But sometimes the men find it really hard as well. So I think the first thing is it something you need to respond to? So there's always that rule, when I was a kid, my mum used to say, count to 10. And that's a really important rule because it gives you a chance to think. So is it something you should respond to, or should you go away and respond later? Is it something where there's an easy answer, like, why do you say that? What's that based on? And sometimes it might be, let them go through, and then when it's coffee time, go and talk to them again afterwards, And sometimes you're just not going to get anywhere by arguing. You're just going to give yourself a headache and spoil your Sunday lunch, so don't bother. Thinking because of coronavirus and lockdown and preaching to cameras and not knowing who your congregation are, actually, I'm really glad I said that, because we can't be relevant at the moment, can we? We don't know who we're talking to most of the time. I know we get about 40 people on a Sunday in the congregation, and we know that most of them are not watching live, and yet we've got a similar number watching live when we're doing the service. So who are they and where are they coming from? So I'm glad that I talked about resonance rather than relevance. I think relevance is really difficult because we don't know people's lives and we don't know people's experiences. And it reinforces that patriarchal thing that the preacher knows best, even though it's your life. And the preacher doesn't know best, actually. The preacher knows some things, but not everything. And the preacher might be able to pick out something that is new, that sets you off on a journey of discovery through that particular text. But doing that one-to-one relevance, this means that you must kind of preaching. I mean, it was called university preaching, wasn't it? And it was the Franciscans and the Dominicans began it in about I can't remember, but several centuries ago. And it held sway until the new homiletic came along. So it's a very dominant thing historically, but it was based in that kind of lecture style sermon, which A, isn't culturally relevant at the moment, and B, does give the impression that of patriarchal preaching. Yeah. I think I avoid trying to make one-to-one relationships between the bits of the sermon and people's lives. But I try to do it either by talking about where my experience might be relevant, or looking at the text in a different way. So I talked about when Paul was being chased through the streets by the girl with the unclean spirit, for example, and the silversmiths got fed up about it. And we look at Paul there as being the person in power because he casts out the demon and all that. But actually, he spends a couple of days being totally oblivious of this girl. He's wandering around the streets, either ignoring her or just letting her get on his nerves. And so when I preached it that way, that opened up the whole thing. And people could think not about this girl and Paul and power and spirit, but about when is it that something gets on my nerves and actually it's God speaking. It just changes the balance. So, and it might be a whole range of different things that does that. It's not easy. The thing that started me off on this kind of journey was one of my ordinance students, a woman, and she said to me, I feel as though I've never been taught to preach as myself. I feel as though I've always been taught to preach like a man, which meant structure, rationality, and all those things. And she was feeling really worn down by that. So I don't want that to happen to you. So guard your own voice. I can't remember the name of the jazz trumpeter, but he said it takes a lifetime to find your own voice and your own style. So if you're well on the way to that, then guard that. I think in terms of study, as somebody who's marked about 700 sermons now in the past few years, look more for what's authentic than what will get a good mark. Be more interested in what's you than what your tutor wants, because that's more true to you. I'm not saying, it might be that you get a fantastic tutor. I don't know where you're going or anything. I know that lots of women get ordained never having been taught preaching by a woman. They've been taught how to preach by men all the way through, even if they've been on a 3-year residential course. So it's difficult to do that. And I think engage with women writers about preaching. Look at Anna Carter Florence, look at Kate Bruce and people like that, and add them to your wider reading list. Almost, when you're given something to read it as a woman and think, well, what does this say about me? Where do I fit into this? So think with your head, where's my voice in this? Can I find my place in this? And then if you can't, critique the book, critique what you're being taught. So have confidence in who you are and what you've learned from your experience, and use it to hone your skills and develop your own voice still further. So I never write the actual introductory sentences until I'm in the service, because that's when you know what's in the news, who's in the pews and all that kind of thing. I don't believe that you have to grab attention. I think that research shows that congregations want you to preach well. So you've already got them. They're already on your side. They're yours to lose. So I don't try and make a big impact at the beginning to gain a hearing. I've got it. And then I think, where does this passage sit with me, kind of thing. So my preparation style of preaching is to think first, who am I when I sit in front of this text? And what questions does it make me ask? And then when I go to a commentary, if I do, which I don't that often, it's to check that I might be right. So I'm not reading the passage and then reading the commentary and thinking, right, what does this erudite white male from 50 years ago think I ought to be saying today? I read it and think, what's it asking me? What's it making me think? What questions does it make me ask? And then a theme, as I research that, a theme will become apparent. And then it depends what that theme is, really, how I relate that to the congregation. But quite often, I think some of the beginnings of my sermons might sound a bit like I'm just musing on something. Wouldn't it be strange if, or whatever, that kind of thing. Because I'm the host, really. And at any good cocktail party, the host doesn't impose themselves on the conversation. They facilitate the conversation. But they introduce people to each other who they think might be interested in each other. So it's more that kind of process about what's interesting in this passage that I might introduce to people in the congregation, and they might get on. They might go somewhere together. It might be creative. You almost don't want to sound as though you're preaching, do you? You want to sound as though you just walked down that same path to the church door that the congregation did. And if something happens on that path, then that's great, That's all part of this living a preaching life idea that I talk about a lot, and it's the link with discipleship, I think, that good preachers who preach because that's the core of their ministry, don't prepare sermons. They live preaching lives. So you're constantly going on a walk or talking to your kids or whatever and thinking, oh, that's interesting. I wonder where God was in that. And then you read a passage and think, that's where it was. Like in my book, and I think on the film, I talk about going for a walk with my grandson, who was 2 at the time, and people totally ignoring what we were doing because it looked like an old woman and a young kid, and obviously they definitely don't know what they're doing. and everybody missed what we saw, not because it wasn't there, but because people couldn't take seriously the fact that we might have seen something. And that story resonated with somebody in the congregation who I could not have known was there. So it's the living a preaching life is a different thing from preparing sermons. That one, I don't know whether I said this in the film or not, but one Lent, I decided every morning to go for a walk around the local park, which is about 2 miles or something, and take a photograph every morning of where I thought God might be, what I might see of God on that walk. And it was brilliant because it trained my mind to look for God in everyday things, which then helped my preaching, I think. You know, as opposed to looking at the Bible or theology first and thinking I must have an illustration about that. It's just every day living the thing, living the vocation. I think formation needs to focus more on the fact that you're not called to be accepted or liked, you're called to be you. And for my money, the Bible's quite clear about that you're called to be yourself, and to do things that only you can do. I think pastorally, there's an unhelpful emphasis sometimes on the people who make the most noise. So the people who demand your attention because they're hurting or because they disagree with you or whatever it might be. And there isn't enough pastoral attention on the quiet majority. So it strikes me, you know, the story where Peter walks on water, and it's great, and we talk about, oh yeah, give me faith and let me step out of the boat and all that kind of stuff. But actually Jesus is only revealed as who Jesus is when he gets into the boat with the people who were just simply keeping the boat going. You know, it's at that point where we realize who Jesus is. And there's something helpful, I think Jesus thought Peter needed to know two things. One was who Jesus is and one was who Peter was. So he let him walk on the water for a bit and then he made him face plant in it, you know, because that's the two things we need to know. So I think we need to formationally encourage people to be shaped more like themselves rather than like the church institution. And pastorally, we need to learn to listen to the quiet majority and the voices around the edges of that, rather than the people in the middle who make the most noise. Yeah, those are two things off the top of my head where I think training should change. I'm publishing an article in the Journal of Feminist Theology in September about how I think preaching should be taught. And one of the big things I say is we need to get rid of rationalist preaching and A to B preaching and start doing this more imaginative preaching that invites people into a space where they encounter God rather than where they find out how clever I am at constructing arguments. I think constructing rational arguments is a way of hiding, and preachers love to hide, don't they? We kind of, there's a cupboard of masks in every vestry, and there's the mask of the confident preacher and the mask of the faithful preacher and all those, and we decide which one to put on before we go out and preach. And, you know, rational arguments are a way of hiding that we're not that sure. And the more rational the argument, the less sure the preacher, probably. The way we dress is a way of hiding. Using commentaries and the original Hebrew words and all that is a way of hiding. There are loads of ways of hiding in the pulpit, and we can even convince ourselves that that's not what we're doing, but actually we are, I think. In sermons, of being able to say, this is the way I see it, or I think, because then it raises, hopefully, in the minds of the people who are listening, well, if she sees it that way, I wonder how I see it. Whereas if we say this is the way it is, there's no room for the congregation to imagine anything at all. So that's part of what I think is important. I think painting pictures and relating to everyday life is important, because we might talk about, I was at a sermon one time that was dreadful, and it was in the middle of a city centre, and he was talking about having been on this estate in the Bahamas or something, and there was like no traction whatsoever. Whereas if we say, you know, I was sitting on the bus and it suddenly struck me that most of the congregation, as well, not maybe not these days, but you know, most of the congregation will have done that kind of thing. And so it invites them to say, look, I experience God in this everyday way, and I think you might be able to as well. So you're almost placing confidence in the congregation. You know how Paul quite often says, I think I've got the Holy Spirit too, but so do you, so make up your own mind. It's doing that kind of thing, isn't it? Rather than saying this is the answer, so learn it and then we can move on. It's that kind of, what's the Holy Spirit saying to you? Even women preachers, according to the research, don't always preach as women. So they say the same things about sin and the same things about Bible women as men might say. You know, pride is still the besetting sin, despite the fact that for women it isn't. And so you can be embodied as a woman and still preach like a man. Susan Derber says quite a lot about that. But I think, first of all, speak from your scars, not your wounds, which is what I think Nadia Bolz-Weber says. If something's too raw, then you still haven't processed it. On the other hand, it can be really powerful to speak from something that you're going through. So when years and years and years ago now, my son was expelled from school, and it was a school that a lot of kids from the same church went to. And so, as in all loving Christian communities, there was quite a lot of gleeful hand rubbing that my son had fallen foul of the law, you know, kind of thing. But I preached the next day, because the sermon was on bear one another's burdens. And so I could do that authentically. I didn't have that much respect for the school authorities that I was going to be too upset by it. But I could talk authentically about what it felt like to have your burdens shared and to not have your burdens shared. So be careful with that kind of thing. And I think silencing yourself and framing things as doctrinal propositions rather than real experiences it silences the gospel in a way. 6 years ago now, my daughter nearly died. She was 22 days on life support. And so we went through all the ups and downs of that. But when it came to Easter Day, I knew how to preach about hope, because I knew what it is to not let go, that final glimmer of hope that eventually sees the darkness go. I could do that then in a way I've never been able to do before. And it was a different sermon from a doctrinal Jesus is risen, isn't that great kind of sermon, you know. I mean, I preached the day after my mum died, because my mum's lifelong verse was, we preach Christ crucified. And I thought, if the day after she's died, I say I can't preach Christ crucified, that's not honouring to her memory. You know, in some ways my mum was my lodestar, if you like, faith-wise. And so I wanted to do what was honouring to her and not honouring to my emotions.